What I want to visit with you about today is the National Retail Benchmarking Project that we've been conducting since 2012. We being National Pork Board funded through work that I've helped collaborate with in 2012, 2015, 2018, and then in 2022. So going back to 2012, we've been conducting this audit and a 3-year cadence, really to take a look at the retail meat case, a deep dive on the retail meat case to understand consistency and quality of pork, also to understand different case metrics and how the meat case is changing, how pork is positioned in the meat case. There's many different components to the retail benchmarking audit, many of them which I'm going to share with you today, but we're going to focus in on the highlights. So from a project scope perspective, we created a novel model to take a look at the retail benchmarking project starting back in 2012. This encompasses 16 major market areas, which is the entire United States. It encompasses retailer penetration, so it includes all major retailers, both nationally branded retailers as well as regionally branded retailers. It includes club stores in the model, and we put a focus on entering stores, really mimicking a consumer and getting a good evaluation and case data on center cut loins and other case metrics. We use center cut loins because we're really focusing on the quality aspect of pork. And in terms of quality, we're talking about things like color and marbling. There's a common method called Japanese color score. The reason we collect that is because it's common to use Japanese color score as a sorting mechanism for export. We do export a significant number of loins based on quality data outside of the United States. We have objective measurements as well, taking a look at not only objective color, but looking at objective tenderness through something called slice shear force. So we look at cook loss, shear force, all the things that would really encompass eating quality for consumers. So when we think about eating quality, we're talking about juiciness, tenderness, and flavor. All three things that certainly pork has a desirable characteristic associated with it. But if you go back to the core of this data, it's really about starting back in 2012, the nuts and bolts of this are, we have a tremendous amount of data around meat quality inside of packing plants. This is saying if you take the entire cold chain into account, after we've sorted things for export, after we've sorted things for example, for a food service, and when we've gone through the cold chain and distributed these pork items out into the retail space, wherever they are in the country, what does the product look like? How does it look? How is it packaged? How does it eat? And that's really a big emphasis of this project. So the pork quality standards, which have been around for decades in this business, really focus on meat's ability to bind water. That is directly correlated to meat color. And then marbling, which everybody's probably familiar with, the intramuscular fat of pork. When we talk about pork, we use color as a very important indicator. Oftentimes in beef, you will see a reference to marbling because beef marbling is highly associated with tenderness and eating characteristics. In pork, color is the most important. And that's an important thing to remember because as I walk you through this deck, it'll help you understand different characteristics of pork as a muscle and things that we talk about in terms of quality. So the retailers that were included in the study is all major retailers in the United States. I mentioned that here just a minute ago. As part of our model, we use census data. We use the 16 market areas. We also use retailer penetration. So the percentage of share of market that an individual retailer has, we take that into account so that we don't oversample and so that we don't undersample. So almost all major brands are represented here inside of this data. So when we take that into account, we're able to get a very good collection of not only retailers, but we're also getting a wide distribution of the packer processor community. And that ensures that we are getting a good sampling of product coming from producers all throughout the United States. So jumping into the results and the data, when we talk about this loin and we talk about color, when we really want to break it down, we break it into buckets. And those buckets are talking about color scores of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's 1 being the palest colored pork, 6 being some of the darkest colored pork. And we start to break this loin down and thinking about the percentage of supply that is available. And I'm going to touch on that several times here as we start moving through this data. So to start, the very first thing here that we quantify is the changing in product enhancement. And when I talk about something being product enhanced, I'm talking about something actually being needle injected. So an injection typically of water, salt, and phosphate. There are many different proprietary blends of that. And if you go back into the 2012 data, a significant amount of the product in 2012 was what we call enhanced pork. That's when we've actually physically enhanced the muscle like we do with some processed meats as a means of enhancing tenderness, enhancing weight by adding water, salt, and phosphate into that. Since 2012, we've seen a significant decline in enhanced product. There's many different reasons for that, but leading up into the 2022 data, we see over 95% of the product called non-enhanced product. And when we show some of these slides, you're going to see it broken into enhanced and non-enhanced, and then you're going to see it broke into in-lab and in-store. So backing up just a little bit on the product, when we enter a store, we are assessing all of the case metrics, including other proteins in the case, linear feet of the case, a lot of different items around labeling, endpoint cooking temperature, point of sale activities, but we're focused also on the center cut loin chops. So we will evaluate under a store's lighting condition, the products that are there, and then we will actually purchase at least 10 packages of every brand represented in the case. And a brand can be an individual packer, processor, or retailer's specific brand. And then if it is enhanced or non-enhanced, those are considered 2 separate brands. So we evaluate every different brand we find in the case. We then purchase it. We set up a meat lab, a small meat science portable lab in market. We bring that product out as a consumer. We put it under a controlled lighting, and then we do both objective and subjective evaluation for what we call in-lab data. So there's a lot of data points here when we talk about pork as a muscle and meat science itself. And that's where I'm going to jump into this color piece first. So this year, we have a lot of exciting data to present to producers on behalf of producers because they funded this through the pork checkoff. And when we look at color and we talk about in laboratory, so under a controlled lighting, out of packaging, what sometimes we reference as true color, we've seen nearly a 2-fold increase in consistency on subjective color since the 2018 data. Now, remember, this is benchmarking data. So while it is subjective, we've had the same evaluators going into market year on year on year, and we're evaluating those individual loins in the case. That's a significant difference, a 2-fold increase, where today we have just over 60% of that product that is categorized as a color score 3 or higher. The reason why color score 3 matters is because if you think about the pork quality chart that breaks down individual color and marbling, 3 is a typical threshold of what we call good pork. It is also typically the specification break for export. So we usually use anything less than 3 as a needs improvement category, 3 as what we would call good product, and then a color score, let's say of a 4, for example, as being something that is darker in color, as being on the higher end. Now, you don't want a color score 6. We don't see color score 6s, but this is really about pushing pork into the middle where we want a lot of that product to be a 3 and 4 in color. So it's an indicator of the meat being more juicy, therefore more tender. So this 2-fold increase is big news year on year on year. And whenever we look at the first slides of data, it shows how deep we can actually go. We can go back to 2012 data that's in-store enhanced versus 2012 store non-enhanced. We can look at it in labs and other pieces. Today, what I'm going to show you is really going to focus on the 2018 data versus the 2022 data. So this is really with an effort of continuous improvement. If you look at subjective color in lab, so that's in the meat lab that we've set up in market in 2022, and you take a look at subjective color, we've seen a significant improvement in product in that 3 categories. So that really good pork category, we've seen a big jump there. I mentioned a 2-fold increase. And the good news here is that what we've seen is that where we have the rise in the middle, it didn't come off the top. It actually came off of the bottom. So the decrease almost exactly on less than color screen 3 pork is where we saw a gain in the middle of that 3 or above product. So this is very positive when we think about the percentage of product in retail picking up on color consistency across the board. When we look at Japanese color score, it's the exact same story as what we've seen with subjective color score, where we've pulled off or gained in the middle in that 3 or above category, it's actually come off the bottom. So this agrees with the data that we saw on subjective color. Instrumental color, so that is the use of something called a Minolta colorimeter. A Minolta colorimeter measures 3 different space values. It would be the same tool that you would use to match a paint chip, for example. So we really put a lot of focus sometimes on what we call L-star value, which is white to black hue. So something that was a 0 L-star would be a 0 on the L-star category. That would be pure black. And if something was pure white, it would be a 100 on the scale. So it's very common to kind of associate a color score with an objective measurement off of the Minolta colorimeter. And that's what we did when we looked at instrumental color. We call anything less than a 56 L-star a color score 3 or less. So that makes them a 1 or a 2. We call anything between a 50 and a 56 a color score 3, and then anything greater than 50 a color score 4 or above. And if you look at the data in 2022, this is one interesting point, is that it actually shows that around 60% of that product that is less than a color score 3, which is slightly different than what I told you on subjective color. However, we know the reason for this is that we also have seen a tendency of increased marbling. And whenever you exclude the marbling, the high marbling pork of 4% or greater out of the data, it starts to normalize. And by normalize, I mean, it goes back to agreeing with what we saw on subjective data. So one thing we plan to do in 2025 versus using a colorimeter is actually using some imaging technology we have. Because one thing a colorimeter can't do is it can't tell the difference between the white marbling and the red protein itself that is pork. So just a side note from a meat science perspective. When we talk about marbling in store, we've had a fairly consistent marbling over time. I show the data from 2015, 18, and 22 that we have a significant amount of this product that really falls in the 2 to 3% marbling range. So if you look at the data itself in terms of the in-lab data we see, 2 to 3% marbling, the number has slowly changed over time. There's a tendency that we are starting to see more marbling. But from a general perspective of the retail benchmarking data from 2022, around 80% of that product is in the 2 to 3% marbling range. So this is subjective marbling, but there is a tendency there. The good news is the color is improving, and we're seeing an improvement in the marbling as well. So what does all this ladder up to? What it ladders up to is that if we're looking at this from a meat science or from a flavor or palatability standpoint, if we see pork that is darker and we see pork because it's darker, we would expect that to have more water holding capacity, the ability to bind water, then we would expect that product to be more juicy and more tender. Two very positive consumer attributes whenever we talk about palatability. So we do also bring that product back into an offsite lab that is not in market. We package, freeze, and then go through a systematic process for something called slice shear force. And when we look at the slice shear force, we will actually thaw that product out, get a weight, cook the product to a very standard temperature, which is 149 degrees Fahrenheit. And then we will take that product and we will shear it through an objective measurement, and that mimics tenderness in pork. So what it really mimics is it mimics the amount of pressure that it would take someone to chew through a product and get an objective measurement for tenderness. So we look at cook loss, we look at tenderness. If we see darker pork, then what we would expect is we would expect pork to bind more water or have less cook loss. And we would also expect the pork to be more tender. What we saw agrees with the data. So if you see the chart on cook loss percentage in the 2022 data versus 2018, we saw a significant decrease in the amount of high cook loss product. So the categories are 7.5%, 7.5% to 15% or greater than 15% cook loss. No matter what you do when you cook product, when you heat it, grind it, press it, you're going to have some portion of cook loss. But in that particular case, whenever we look at something that's darker and combine more water, we actually have seen a significant improvement in cook loss, where we have around 80% of that product, regardless of enhancement, that falls into a very nice, desirable category of cook loss. This is a big improvement. And all of that leads to tenderness. So if you look at the tenderness values collected in the same manner that we did in 2018 versus 2022, we saw a significant difference. We break these into buckets of very tender, tender, and not tender. The breaks on those are based on the kilograms of force it would take for you to chew through the product. And rather than showing individual pounds or kilos, we actually take that ranges that are acceptable ranges we use in meat science, and we break them into these categories. So if you look at the data on tenderness here, so I just said a moment ago, and you look at the green bars, which are 2018, and you look at the purple bars, which are the 2022 data, again, regardless of enhancement type, there is a significant amount of very tender pork in the case. And that is a very positive attribute for consumers when we talk about trying to make pork tender. So this is good news. When we look at a breakdown of the fresh case, we have several metrics I'm going to run you through here over the next few minutes that just touch briefly on the fresh meat case itself. So we capture average linear feet of the fresh meat case. We often say the meat case really doesn't change much. It's what the set looks like within the meat case. So whether it is alternative proteins, plant-based proteins, or other animal proteins in the case, or meal kits, or other items that might be present, we measure those and we compare them year on year. There's a retail task force that meets prior to the start every year that we actually utilize to ask other questions so that we can get other insights that can help producers, help the National Pork Board, help the marketing strategy to increase volume and value. One of those big hit areas over the last several years has been the growth of ground pork. So as we entered those stores in the 2022 benchmarking project, we actually gathered information on ground pork, where it was in the case, if it was available in the case, and we saw some really favorable results where we've seen a growth in the number of retailers who carry it. We've seen a growth in the average linear feet of that product that is available. That's just one example. So taking a look at how it breaks down is really interesting. Another thing that we saw in the 2022 data is a big conversion of case-ready product versus cut in store. And to define that further, what I mean by that is case-ready product is cut in an offsite plant. It's packaged in an offsite plant. It's typically put into something we call a mother bag, which can help preserve color. It's part of the delivering fresh pork, something that can also preserve shelf life. And what you would see there is an employee just cutting that out of the case and stocking the shelves. Many of you have probably seen this before, versus cut in store, a more traditional butcher type setting. Since 2022, or excuse me, since 2018, certainly the industry has gone through COVID-19, has gone through a lot of changes. There's a lot of issues in labor in this country. So probably not a surprise that we saw a big dip in the amount of product that's actually cut in store. And we saw an increase in the case-ready product, which we expect to see an increase in the 2025 benchmarking study in that area. There's a category that says both, and that's where we saw both were present. They had a butcher shop in store, they had the ability to cut and package, but they were buying case-ready product. And whenever that occurs, we do consumer intercepts, or excuse me, we do meat case intercepts with the store manager or the meat manager there. And we record the purpose of why they're doing both or why they have changed. And in almost all cases, when we ran into this in store, it was a labor issue. It was not a supply chain issue. There was just not enough labor in store to cut the product. And we expect, based on those intercepts and other data we have, that number is probably going to increase by possibly another 15% in 2025. We capture label information. So who is carrying a natural program, who is carrying a breed claim, a production claim, all of those things. We look at natural because that's a very common thing that we see across all the proteins. So we capture natural, as you can see in the slides, where you have 83% of stores carry a natural beef program, 81% of the stores carry a natural pork program. Now, by natural, we mean minimally processed, not naturally raised. So we do try to capture that to pick up on trends and insights that we see at retail. We capture brands because it's important to see where pork can position itself in the case. If you look nationally, there's still on average one brand of pork per store, where we see multiple brands of ground beef, multiple brands of chicken, multiple brands of fresh beef. And we identified this in our study as an opportunity area for pork where we could differentiate and possibly tier pork in the case. And so maybe doing test and learns or doing something where we can actually put some research into this area, I think is a good opportunity for pork to differentiate itself in the case as we see across some of the other proteins. When you look at label claims, certainly there are a lot of claims in the other proteins. That's not altogether different in the pork business, where we have natural, antibiotic-free, hormone-free, cage-free, vegetarian-fed. We capture all of that information. In 2022 versus 18, we actually saw the switch was from the #1 claim in 2018 being hormone steroid-free. We see natural as being the #1 in 2022. So a lot of information that we gather. Tiered programs is another area in the retail benchmark study that we look at. So by tiered programs, that would be, for example, someone carrying 3 different brands or something that differentiated the product in a case as tiered. So for example, where you would have a choice beef program, a prime beef program, and a specialty beef program, something like Wagyu or grass-fed, that would be a tiered program where consumers have choice across things from premium to economy, if you will. When you look at the data there and you look at poultry and beef, there's a lot of tiered programs. The pork business, much like the labeling in store, where we talk about different brands, on average, there's 1 tiered program per store. So this is another area that we highlighted as an area of opportunity for pork. In-point cooking temperature, 145 degrees has been around now for several years, many years in the pork industry as the safe temp, 145 with a 3-minute rest. So we capture that, what retailers are putting on the package. We capture promotional materials and what the temperature recommends, or if the product is case ready. Over the years, 15, 18, and now 22, we've seen an increase in the number of packages that are labeled 145 degrees. So we capture that as a means to feed information back to retailers on labeling or on point of sale materials. You know, there's a lot of other data that we collected in this trial, which I would be happy to share. But if you look at the big takeaways, I've put those buckets in an individual slide to say, if we talk about the big takeaways, fresh pork consistency and quality, it is improving considerably. When you look back in the 2012 data and the shift we have seen over the last decade, it's a considerable improvement and something that I think the pork industry, all of us, should be very proud of. This pork is more tender. The marbling is very consistent. There is an opportunity for pork, and that's really the next steps here that I would like to touch on for a few minutes. We've seen a good growth in ground pork as an opportunity for the entire pork industry to take advantage of that. We know that ground pork fits very well in the case, and we're watching that grow. I talked about the packaging and labeling. Even cooking devices is something that is being discussed today in research for how we present these products to the next generation of consumer that we want to purchase pork. If you look at the next takeaway, and we're looking at center cut loins, there is a significant opportunity for loin value. So the pork loin has been dragging the cutout down for many, many, many years, and is often an on sale item or something that is valued less, especially if you compare that to other middle meats. And we think that there's a big opportunity there, and I'm going to touch on that here in just a minute. But first, the question you might ask is, why? Why are we seeing the improvement? Why do you think we're seeing darker pork? Why do you think we're seeing it more tender over time? And based on our industry data and knowledge, our best answer here is really to say there has been a significant amount of money invested in the pork industry and time by pork producers on the production level, by processors, by packers, by the cold chain, and by retailers to improve quality and consistency of pork. That includes the conversion of CO2 from a harvest standpoint. That includes a couple or several new pork processing plants being built. That includes the chilling method we use, which does have a big impact on pork quality. There have literally been billions of dollars spent improving pork consistency and pork quality, from genetics through feeding strategies, handling strategies, the processor, the packer, and the distributors that get it ultimately to the retailers. And all of this is now laddering up into a really positive story for pork. So as we see this genetic improvement, as we see a focus on quality and consistency, I think that it positions pork in a much better avenue than it did back in 2012 or 2015, where we can chase not only volume, but we can chase value as well, and position pork very, very well in the retail meat case. So I touched on what now? So we collect the benchmarking data. The real question is, what do we do now? And what we do now is we take those insights and we focus on them, and we take the learnings farther. And one of those things that we've touched on is really talking specifically about this loin is the creation of a pork loin task force, where we can do a big deep dive on the loin complex to help understand where the opportunity exists. In the data, I showed you that around 60% of the product we have in retail that we evaluated in the benchmark study is a color score 3 or better. That leaves 40% in the bottom buckets of a 1 and 2 score. So what is a reasonable score to expect in the 2025 and future studies? What type of metrics do we want to see? We want to see improving consistency and quality, and we'll continue to evaluate that. But as we see a significant amount of this product in the case improve, the question is, how do we add value to the loin complex? How do we impact it? There are numerous factors that are involved in it, as I mentioned just a moment ago. Genetics, how the animals are handling, how they are handled, how the processors and packers are handling the animal and the carcass itself, how it's packaged, how it's cut. There are a numerous amount of factors, but there is a tremendous amount of opportunity for that loin complex, especially when you consider that that's a large portion of the carcass And it's also the largest portion of what consumers are presented at retail, is a variety of loin cuts, from center cut loin chops to thin cut, thick cut, lots of different options that are put out there. So we see the loin as being an area that really needs to be focused on. And with this focus is the Loin Complex Task Force, and we're going to take a deep dive and explore a variety of things. The roll of pork is a protein. We have consumer data that talks about taste and preference being a barrier, being the entry into the marketplace. We talk about human nutrition, talk about pork as an ingredient. We certainly know that it's not only nutritious, but it's delicious as well. So what is the roll of pork? Where is its space and place? So where do we position in the pork in the case? How do we position it in the case? How do we fabricate the loin? Should we think about different fabrication methods? Think about, as multicultural continues to grow in this country, a multicultural audience, we could consider possibly, but only exploring with data and with research, fabricating the loin differently might be the way that we move forward to increase both volume and value. It could be further processed, ready to eat items. It also could have a lot to do with labeling, consumer education, and then ultimately, not only the eating experience and how to cook it, what device to cook it with, but then try to create consumer pull-through. That is the actual how to handle it, how to cook it, and getting people to purchase that product as a protein of choice. And so this Loin Task Force is going to set in, and we're going to do a deep dive. This is different than anything we've ever done in the industry before, because we're going to put a very, very strong emphasis on this. I'm contributing as a partner to that with the domestic marketing team at National Pork Board. And this is really saying, we have demonstrated through the benchmarking an improvement in quality and consistency. We're going to take a three-pronged approach to the strategy, and that is grow the base, right? Grow the share, and increase the usage. We're going to have a multi-year commitment to this. The loin has been dragging down the cutout for decades. I mentioned that a minute ago. We've got to think outside the box. This won't happen overnight, but if we set big goals, we do test and learns with individual retailers, we go out into the marketplace and we make bold decisions and bold ideas to think about all the different areas where pork fits. With different generations of consumers, where it fits in taste and flavor, where it fits in meal preparation for families, where it also fits in terms of our we care story as producers. It's sustainability. It's talking about nutrition. There are a lot of areas, and this task force is going to take a big deep dive into this Loin Task Force to really talk about building volume and building value. And what I think is that as you demonstrate the value here, it's creating a method. We have a method in the benchmarking process that measures what we're doing in the industry in terms of quality and consistency. And now we have a now what. And the now what is to put a focus on the loin that's been identified not only domestically, but internationally as a product that has a tremendous future for U.S. pork. And so once we knock out the loin, that gives an opportunity to go after other cuts. But this is an exciting time to try to create volume and value, especially in the current market circumstances that we're in. So that is all I have for today on the retail benchmarking study on the Pork Loin Task Force. And I appreciate your time and would entertain going further. If somebody ever has any questions or comments, I'd be happy to do that. So thank you.